Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, there is a whiff of sedition in America these days. Constitutional crises abound. We've done all sorts of shows recently about them. One with Leah Littman, a University of Michigan professor, law professor, on what she calls the bad vibes of the Supreme Court. She has a new book out, Lawless, about the way in which the Supreme Court is itself, in her view, perhaps seditious. And then we also did a show with David Graham from The Atlantic magazine, whose new book out, The Project, How Project 2025 is Reshaping America, suggests that the Republican Party more broadly is perhaps a seditious organization bent on undermining some of the foundations of the American university. So sedition is something that we've been thinking and worrying about. So it's appropriate that my guest today, Marcus Alexander Gadson, a professor of law in North Carolina, has a new book out, Sedition, How America's Constitutional Order Emerged from Violent Crisis. And Marcus is joining us from near Raleigh. Marcus, congratulations on the new book. When I saw the subtitle of the book, How America's Constitutional Order Emerged from Violent Crisis, it occurred to me that the very foundations of the Republic emerged from the revolution, which in some people's language was a form of sedition. Is there any truth to that, Marcus?
I think it depends on who you ask. So if you ask King George III, he would absolutely tell you that the founding fathers engaged in not just sedition or insurrection, but treason. And if you ask Thomas Jefferson and the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence, they would have said they had every moral right to do what they did. But yeah, that certainly could be argued that the American Revolution does fit the dictionary definition for an insurrection or something like that, which raises interesting questions such as, are there morally justified insurrections, if that is in fact an accurate description?
Yeah, and two things occurred to me out of your very honest response. Firstly, does that suggest that all this stuff is relative, that law itself and sedition are by definition relative, whether you look at it from Jefferson's point of view or the King of England's point of view, you get very different responses? And the second, perhaps more interesting in a way, is that given America was born in this violence, this revolution or rebellion against its colonial master, is it surprising that the history of America is peppered with so much violence, political history?
I absolutely don't think so at all. And I think you have really made an insightful observation here, which is that in order to be in a position to write our first constitution, state and federal, you had to succeed in fighting England. That requires putting on uniforms and shooting at English soldiers. And it also requires coming up with a moral and legal justification for doing so. And then what happens after you do that successfully, other people are going to also naturally ask the question, well, are we morally justified in using violence to try to achieve political ends? And under what circumstances could violence be justified? And if you look at American history, you'll find that in the Dorr Rebellion, which is a chapter in my book, he absolutely would have told you that even though we're engaging in violence, we're following in the footsteps of the founding fathers. If you talk to the secessionists who seceded from the Union during the Civil War, many of them actually imitate the Declaration of Independence in writing ordinances explaining their decisions to leave the Union. So once you take that genie out of the bottle, it becomes an open question of when else it will be justified to engage in violence.
And to add to that, of course, you have some of the founding fathers who were in their own times revolutionaries, like Thomas Jefferson, who famously said, you can even buy T-shirts of this on Amazon these days, that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. In other words, that maybe the official creed of America or of liberty is sedition.
That's fair. That's extremely interesting, and something should be said about Jefferson, which I think is important for listeners to understand. In many ways, he's our most utopian, idealistic founding father, and so he actually is even defending the French Revolution when other Americans are starting to look aghast in horror at it. So that definitely, I think, is a strain of American thought, is that violence is definitely justifiable and that it may even be a praiseworthy thing to engage in. Now, I do want to do this, I think, as somebody who is a fan of the Founding Fathers and loves the American constitutional project. I think it should be said that they didn't just step to taking out guns and shooting at British soldiers. They did spend many, many years trying to raise their grievances to the King of England and to Parliament. So I think it definitely has to be observed that that was not their first resort.
Yeah, and of course, there's a long tradition of thinking about the right to rebellion. It goes back to, well, way beyond the English Civil War and the work of Locke and Hobbes and so on. We don't need to get into that. You mentioned that Jefferson was the most utopian of the founding fathers. We did a show recently also on Benjamin Franklin, who is perhaps the most realistic and technical, shall we say, of the founding fathers. Were there some of the founding figures of the American Republic, Franklin comes to mind, also Madison, of course, and Hamilton, who were more realistic, who recognized in the drawing up of the Constitution and the formulation of a political system the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the American Republic? On the one hand, it came out of revolution. On the other hand, the whole constitutional project was designed to give it stability, to protect it from revolution, and to found it in the law.
That's definitely true. And I think one of the things you will find frequently whenever we have discussions about the founding fathers is people will say the founding fathers thought X or Y or Z. And the reality of the founding fathers is they frequently disagreed with each other. They came from very different worldviews and philosophical places. They had really strong, bitter personal disagreements about everything you can think about, whether that's slavery, whether that's the role of women, whether that is religion and its place in the public square. And I definitely think that actually part of the impetus for the federal constitution that most Americans know about is actually to try to contain the violence that was unleashed from the American Revolution. And so there's this incident called Shays' Rebellion that happens in the 1780s, where you have disappointed Massachusetts residents shutting down courthouses, and you have them disobeying the government. And the founding fathers, many of them at least, are very worried about this. And it actually gives many of them an impetus to say we need a stronger federal structure in order to actually contain instability that's going on at the states. So you're exactly right, that there were founding fathers who saw constitution drafting as a way of trying to put a dampener on some of the violent impulses that had been unleashed.
So, Marcus, are we on a bit of a slippery slope here? I want to come to the 6 examples of sedition in your new book, and we'll come to that in a few minutes, at the local level during the 19th century. But given what you've said, are you suggesting perhaps that January 6th might be thought of in this kind of language as a a rightful rebellion against some sort of injustice?
I think that is definitely an extremely fraught question. And again, it depends on whose shoes you put yourself in. If you talk to many of the protesters who stormed the Capitol, they would have quoted Jefferson or the founding fathers and told you that they were actually protecting the United States. But it's important, actually, I think, to look at the text of our Constitution. If you look at Section 3 of our Constitution, it bars insurrectionists from office. And if you look at other provisions of the Constitution, it describes treason, which is levying war against the United States. And when you look at a term like insurrection, you're really looking at people that are doing a step beyond protesting or registering grievances. Now they're actually trying to functionally prevent government from operating. And I think if you look at January 6th, I think that there is a strong case that that was actually an insurrection. And that is actually what the Colorado Supreme Court found before they were overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. So I think that that day was a terribly scary day for our country, and that it does raise very serious questions about whether or not it is an insurrection.
Yeah, this reiterates the culture war or the education war now raging over January 6th. Recently, in the new Oklahoma school curriculum, students are required to learn what some people see as the big lie. So truth itself is also a very slippery issue when it comes to debates about sedition.
All I can say for these educational standards is I hope that students will be taught that reputable media outlets repeatedly found that fraud or shenanigans or whatever you're going to call it did not explain the result in 2020. And I think to the extent we have policymakers that are not presenting students with that factual information, that is scary to me.
Yeah, and it only reiterates as well the importance of new books like yours that deal in an objective way with American history. So tell me why you wrote this book, Sedition, How America's Constitutional Order Emerged from Violent Crisis. You choose 6 incidents in the 19th century, everything from the Buckshot War and Dorr Rebellion to the 1876 South Carolina gubernatorial election. Why the book and why these 6 case studies?
So the genesis of the book actually is before Donald Trump was president. It starts out in 2013. I am a student in law school, and I am writing a paper about the history of judicial elections in America. One thing led to another, and then I end up researching Arkansas during Reconstruction, and something that was almost completely tangential to my point ended up being the Brooks-Baxter War. And so I just remember being completely taken in when I learned that you had this election where you had corrupt election officials burn ballots and substitute ballots for other ballots, where you had somebody kick their opponent out of the governor's mansion, where you had militias fighting street battles, where you had the government at the federal level divided about who to support. And that got me interested in this subject of constitutional crisis, of violence being really important and a fundamental part of America's story. And from that day in 2013, when I first learned about this, it's been an ongoing subject of fascination for me. And so I kept studying, I kept finding out different examples of this. And eventually I concluded that constitutional crisis might be overused in ordinary speech, especially by political commentators, and we may come back to that. But I am firmly convinced that constitutional crisis is underappreciated in terms of its role in American history. And so I wrote this book because I wanted to call attention to that. I wanted people to understand that a major facet of American constitutional development has been crisis moments, has been failure, has been people taking the law into their own hands. As far as these 6 stories, I wanted to.
But before that, I want to come to the 6. Oh,
sure.
Just before we get to the 6 stories, and I know I asked that question earlier, why did you leave out the Civil War? Because isn't that the biggest story of them all? I mean, of course, many, many, many books have been written about it, about the military and constitutional, extra constitutional side of it. But is the Civil War itself the exhibit A of America's constitutional order emerging from violent crisis?
I think I think what you said is absolutely correct. And so in part of the book, I do briefly discuss how the Civil War was a constitutional crisis. And I think, if you're trying to define constitutional crisis, having 600,000 people die shooting at each other in different uniforms probably is something we can all agree on. And I think you were absolutely right also to focus on the idea that the Civil War changes our constitutional order. And you can see that when you look at the text of the federal Constitution. So the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment promising equal protection of the law, and the 15th Amendment allowing Black men to be able to vote. And then another change that it led to that is less understood, I think, by many Americans, which is it fundamentally reshapes state constitutions. Because the South loses the Civil War, they have to rewrite new state constitutions to enter the Union. And those state constitutions actually, in some ways, are the height of Black involvement in American politics. You look at a place like South Carolina, they've got a majority Black constitutional convention after the Civil War. So the Civil War has a much bigger impact than just the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It also has really left a big shadow over our state constitutions as well.
Yeah, and we're going to come to the 6 examples, but what's also missing is examples of slave rebellions. Would they be, again, legitimate examples of sedition, at least according to the formal law?
Well, yes. And again, that begs a question of, could there be such a thing as morally justified treason or morally justified insurrection? Now, I will say the treason part is actually tricky before the Civil War. And the reason is because there's a case called Dred Scott, which says that Black Americans can't be citizens. And the textbook definition of treason is going to be when a citizen levies war against their own government. And this actually comes up in the aftermath of John Brown's rebellion in Virginia right before the Civil War, which the question becomes raised, if you guys said that Black people aren't citizens, then how can they be guilty of treason and actually be guilty of violating their allegiance to a country that won't recognize them as citizens? So that's absolutely an interesting angle. You look at Nat Turner's rebellion, many slave rebellions. Here's what I would say about that. When I think about constitutional crisis or something like that, I'm actually thinking about moments where a constitutional order is on the verge of failure or at serious risk of failure. And I think if you look at something like Nat Turner's rebellion, or you look at Gabriel's rebellion in Virginia, it just isn't the case that the constitutional order was seriously on the verge of failure.
Well, you've been very patient, Marcus. Let's get to your 6 examples. All very interesting. I have to admit, I'm not familiar with all of them. Some of them I know more about. You begin with the Buckshot War of 1838, which I think is the only pre-Civil War example. Oh, no, actually, Dorr Rebellion as well. Tell me about the Buckshot War and it.
The Buckshot War is interesting in part because it is a less well-known part of Thaddeus Stevens' story. So Thaddeus Stevens is a famous abolitionist who is outspoken against slavery and plays a major role in the Republican Party in the 1850s and 1860s. And so what you've got going on during the Buckshot War is you have, at first glance, what looks like a standard election campaign where you have 2 candidates facing off against each other.
In Pennsylvania, of course.
In Pennsylvania, of course, swing state. And you have a campaign where wild charges are being made. So you have Some candidate supporters saying that one of them actually was somebody who played a role in a murder. You have another candidate supporters accusing them of committing adultery and fraudulently committing bankruptcy, which may have some echoes today. And when election day comes, instead of having a clear result, you've got a dispute, and neither candidate for governor is willing to concede. And there are also some uncalled seats in the State House of Representatives, and that is going to determine who controls the State House of Representatives. Will it be the Whigs and the anti-Mason coalition, or is it going to be the Democrats? And things just keep getting worse and worse and worse in those uncalled races. And one of the problems is that the judges who decide which votes to count and which to report are all affiliated with political parties. So the Democratic judges come up with one vote total, the Whig judges come up with another vote total, and then that raises the question, whose vote total do you believe? The Secretary of the Commonwealth says, I believe the Whigs because he is a Whig. Democrats in the legislature try to get their own returns introduced. And so it comes to a point where the State House of Representatives can agree on which results to count, and two people end up getting inaugurated Speaker of the House of Representatives, and they actually try to have a legislative session at the same time. So I want you to try to imagine Hakeem Jeffries trying to gavel Congress to order, and then Mike Johnson trying to gavel the House to order. That's what you have. And people are booing, they're hissing, and then people go to the Senate and they try to kill some of the Whigs because they're convinced that they're trying to kill an election. Thaddeus Stevens actually ends up jumping out of a window and surviving a mob that's coming to kill him. You have gangs that are roaming in the city. You have Democratic officials who are participating in this. You have people take over a state armory building. And when you have a state armory building taken over, you've got disorder in the streets. It'd probably be good if we knew whose side the militia was on, right? You're going to call out the militia to try to restore order, except that nobody was quite sure on whose side the militia was on. So the governor actually asked the militia commander to meet with his cabinet. He comes and he's actually asked point blank, will you support the governor? And he says, well, I'll have to decide for myself. I'll look at the order and I'll decide. And this whole time that Pennsylvania is spiraling into a situation where nobody knows who won the governor's race, nobody knows who won the State House of Representatives, the militia is a free agent that might take whatever side it wants. The governor is also appealing to Washington, D.C. for help. And Washington, D.C. ends up not giving a consistent judgment. Eventually, Martin Van Buren declines to intervene. But Congress then investigates his refusal to intervene. So it becomes just a story that is one comedy of errors and one.
But was it? I mean, it's called the Buckshot War, Marcus. Was it actually a war? There was some violence.
There was violence. There's a state arsenal that is taken over. There's rumors that swirl that one of the candidates actually was going to raise his own personal army and march on Harrisburg, which is the capital of Pennsylvania, and have himself inaugurated. And the militia is called out. And the way it gets its title is the commander of the militia says that every man in the militia needs to be issued with a certain number of rounds of buckshot in order to load in their muskets at the time. And so that's where it gets its title from.
Fortunately, nobody also, there's another example of sedition in your book, the Brooks-Baxter War, which I think so-called Arkansas Civil War. This was the first one you found that maybe triggered the whole book. How is this similar and different from the Buckshot War?
It is similar in that you have a disputed election, you have accusations of fraud, accusations of schemes and shenanigans and stolen elections. But it's actually the Buckshot War taken to 11 in a lot of ways. And what I mean by that is the Buckshot War ends up ending peacefully. But in the Brooks-Baxter War, Joseph Brooks spends about a year and a half refusing to concede his election. And eventually he gets a court to side with him, and he marches up to Arkansas State House and kicks Elisha Baxter out. And the reason I say it's the Buckshot War taken to 11 is because about 20 people did end up dying in street battles. So in some ways, it's actually a glimpse of how much worse the Buckshot War could have been if it had dragged on longer.
And then some of these just take place in a year, but Bleeding Kansas, Bloody Kansas, the Border War, this lasted 5 years between 1854 and 1859. How bloody was this war?
Okay, so I think Bleeding Kansas is something that many Americans will have heard of but may not quite appreciate. You've got dozens and dozens of people killed and many, many more wounded. You have people murdered, and you actually have, in many ways, it's a dress rehearsal for the Civil War. And one of the things that people observe at the time is people write these articles saying, you know, in Kansas, you have these separate militias and they fight like they're fighting over in Europe, where you've got two sides exchanging gunfire. They actually negotiate for the exchange of prisoners. And so it really is a war that's going on. And that is part of the reason why we know that the country's in trouble. We look at Kansas, we see them fighting over slavery, we see people dying in these battles, and we know that that's coming for America soon. People at the time recognized that it was a really terrible omen for the country.
We seem to, or certain people seem to fetishize terrorism these days, the word terrorism, always using it to describe un-American activity of one kind or another. But one of the other examples, the 1876 South Carolina gubernatorial election, was in a sense an example of state terrorism, wasn't it? Or insurrectionary terrorism?
Everything. So it's an example of terrorism. You literally have two organizations started up for the purpose of sowing terrorism. One of them is well known, the Ku Klux Klan, and they are specifically organized to take on the Republican Party. They murder black officials. And then you have the Red Shirts, which took a prominent role in the 1876 election, which is another terrorist organization. And so as part of these terrorist organizations, they would actually intimidate people from voting. If you were a black man and a Republican, they might come to your house and beat you and threaten to murder you if you voted. They would actually come to polling places and they would sit out there with guns and prevent black voters from going up there to vote. And I will just say that South Carolina is an example not just of violence, it's treason. You know, if treason is attempting to overthrow a government to which you owe allegiance, that's South Carolina. They literally are trying to overthrow South Carolina's government through violent means when they owe them obedience. And I think the ironic thing about that is if you talk to South Carolina white supremacists, if you ask them, hey, did black slaves owe the government of South Carolina allegiance before the Civil War? Were they obligated to obey the government? They would have said yes. But then when the government changes hands, they don't feel the same obligation.
The final example you have in the book is of the Wilmington insurrection, which is also of 1898, also known as the Wilmington Massacre. There have been other massacres. Tulsa also comes to mind. What was it about Wilmington that made it encourage you to turn it into an example in the Sedition book and leave out other massacres like Tulsa?
I think those are both very serious tragedies. For Wilmington, there's a couple of points I would make about that. One of those points is I think that chronologically, Wilmington is very interesting because it actually happens over 30 years after the Civil War. And it happens at a time where you have populist cooperation with Black Americans and Black voters. And so you have this tantalizing prospect of an alliance between white populists and Black Republicans that isn't present as the 20th century starts to dawn.
And some progressive populists like Thomas Frank actually look back to this period with a degree of nostalgia.
Mm-hmm. And the other piece is its connection to a constitutional revision that took place in North Carolina. Many Americans don't know this. For that matter, many North Carolinians don't know this. But after the Wilmington insurrection, there was an amendment that was added to the North Carolina Constitution that basically disenfranchised the vast majority of Black voters in North Carolina. And one of the points I make in the book is that I think Wilmington in a lot of ways is a warning as part of that broader campaign to disenfranchise Black voters. This is what we will do to a government that is beholden to Black voters. And so you really have an example of a coup d'etat happening in Wilmington, which again isn't present in somewhere like Tulsa, as tragic as Tulsa is.
Finally, Marcus, I'm curious as to the genealogy of the word sedition. There was, of course, the Alien Sedition Act of 1918. We've done some shows on that. What's your sense of the genealogy of the word sedition? Does it mean the same thing today in 2025 than it did in the early 20th century or indeed in the 19th century?
I think the definitions are going to be relatively similar. So if you look up sedition today, a lot of people will describe it really as rebellion against lawful government authority. And if you look at dictionaries in the 1800s, a lot of them will similarly start to describe sedition as a way of encouraging disruption of lawful authority. So there is a lot of overlap between how it's used today and how it would have been used in the 1800s. I think as you just sort of referenced sedition, and I love that you did this, it goes back even before American history, before the colonial era, and it has roots far earlier than that. In fact, it's a word, to the best of my knowledge, that is borrowed from Latin and has Latin roots. So it's not just something that's happened in America.
Yeah, and of course, the Romans wrote about it, Machiavelli wrote about it, many other political thinkers have focused on the idea of sedition. And finally, Marcus, I have to ask you this in late May 2025. Are we in a constitutional crisis in America? Is the whiff of sedition, is it for real?
Let me preface my answer with this, which is that it is much easier to tell whether you're in a constitutional crisis in retrospect than it is at the time. And the analogy I will give is if you watch football, a lot of the time it's easier to tell on Monday morning whether the receiver was open than when you're actually being blitzed and you're in the pocket trying to throw. That said, I'm extremely worried about where we are as a country today. And there's a couple of things that have me worried. One of them is something that's just not a news cycle story anymore, but it's how we dealt with January 6th. And so on January 6th, you had an attempt to overturn the results of a presidential election. All of the people were either pardoned or a select few received commutations instead of pardons. And that worries me for the precedent that sets, which is that you can try to overthrow an election and you still may have a political career after that. And the worry that I have is that this becomes a spiral and that other candidates will try to pull what happened on January 6th and look at our current occupant of the White House and think, well, he was able to do this, why shouldn't I try? Because the worst case is I just run again in 4 years and I have it shot like nothing happened. Maybe the best case is I do force myself into office. So that has me very worried that just has not been repudiated decisively the way I would have hoped. The other thing that has me worried in 2025 is the Trump administration and their willingness to obey court orders. And you have this case with Abrego Garcia where the Supreme Court has said facilitate his return, and the return is not being facilitated. And what that worries me about is thinking, well, what else is not going to be obeyed? If they say that you can't take away Harvard's tax exempt status, or they say that you can't unilaterally get rid of birthright citizenship? Will those be obeyed? And I don't have definitive answers. Perhaps the Trump administration in the end will comply, and indeed that's my hope. But those worry me a great deal about how fragile of a place we're in right now.
Well, when the lawyers start worrying, we should all be worried. Like Leah Lippman, our guest, Marcus Alexander Gadson, the author of a new book called Sedition, is worried about America's constitutional crisis. Marcus, thank you so much for your wise words, and I hope you're wrong. Thank you.
I also hope to be wrong. Thank you so much.